2002. A wonderful year, right? Well, I don't know, not really. American rah-rah patriotism was a behemoth like no one had ever seen before. Cinema had been relegated to mostly teen slashers and rom-coms. The health food craze was far from its starting point. The music industry had begun to push flash-in-the-pan, milquetoast alt-rock bands and new metal sideshows, and even the coolest mainstream acts had begun to fall to the disapproval of their loyal fans. So what good could have come from such a weird and unlikely time? And where from? What if I told you that something was brewing, something different, something that would challenge the mainstream, something from the bowels of Queens, New York? Would you believe me?
Nigga use a window shopper. You mad at me? I think I know why. Nigga use a window.
What?
Well, then you'd be fucking stupid, because that's not the right answer. In a small, boring town called Westchester, Pennsylvania, grew a group of young misfits who had already begun to take the world by storm. In 2000, a television show titled Jackass premiered on the MTV network. While many dismissed the show as a showcase of untalented idiots performing ridiculous stunts, the show would go on to amass high ratings and a dedicated fan base. The show featured professional skateboarding youth Bam Margera and his close friends from Westchester, Brandon DiCamillo, Ryan Dunn, Rake Yan, among a host of others who were located in sunny California. An interesting piece about the show was that the creators Jeff Tremaine and Spike Jonze had approached Margera after seeing his sports comedy series CKY. Margera allowed the show to heavily feature clips and outtakes from his first two films. While this was quite a digression, what is important to note is that the creators of the show made a point to use music of their own tastes, rather than the overplayed schlock on MTV. With this in place, the very first episode debuted with a song by a relatively unknown band, and that band was Camp Kill Yourself. Or Camp. Or CKY. I'll explain that later at some point, but what is important to know is that there is a CKY crew, a CKY movie series, and a CKY band. CKY, the band of course, was comprised of lead singer, rhythm guitar player, and songwriter Darren Miller, lead guitarist and producer Chad Ginsburg, and the older brother of Bam, Jess Margera, on the drums. So why was CKY different? What even warranted the dramatic backstory in the first place? CKY as a band is a result of an amalgamation of Darren Miller's love of 70s disco, 80s slashers, and 90s death metal. While most bands in 2002 were writing drop C-tuned, power chord alt-rock songs about breaking up with their girlfriends, Darren Miller's mind roamed elsewhere. Lovey-dovey subject matter was off the table, and instead songs about amnesia, a quiet town with a murderous populace, agoraphobia, and split personalities were all up for grabs. The sound of CKY was also something that separated them far from the mainstream rock and metal acts of the time. In 1997, Darren Miller purchased a Boss OC2 octave guitar pedal. Now, I'm not a guitar genius or a gearhead in the slightest, but what I can tell you is that when a single guitar note is played, this guitar pedal creates two duplicate tones, one octave below and two octaves below. Just listen. This allows the player to use single-note riffs and sound as if they are playing power chords. Not only that, but it creates a very fat, almost electronic sound with distortion. Darren Miller's use of the Boss OC2 octave pedal on nearly every fucking CKY song was a service to the band as it created a recognizable sound. With Chad Ginsburg as producer, the band was able to explore the innumerable possibilities of where music can be taken in studio. In spite of the endless flow of meat and potatoes rock bands that featured only guitar, drums, bass, and vocals, Miller and Ginsburg sought to add an 80s flair to the music by using Moog synthesizers to deepen the atmosphere. In 2001, with over 20,000 units of their first album, Volume 1, sold via word of mouth and fairly limited airplay, and a strong fan base backing them, CKY signed with Island Def Jam. With their own vision in mind, they set forward to outdo themselves and break through to the mainstream with a brand new album. This album was known as Infiltrate, Destroy, Rebuild. From the very first moments of the album's opener, Escape from Hellview, the listener gets the immediate sense of urgency. The music is unusual, it's aggressive, but refined. It's fresh. With the intricate guitar riffs and tightly matching drum rhythms, one can only imagine what is in store for the rest of the album. Escape from Hellview is a riveting opening track that is both musically and lyrically a continuation of Volume 1's opener, 96 Quite Bitter Beings. Written while Miller was watching 80s slasher Madman, the song continues the running horror theme so prevalent in CKY's music. The second track, Flesh into Gear, is one of the most sonically heavy of the album. The octave pedal fueled riff really makes it sound like the song is tuned in B standard or something. And Miller's brittle growling really contrasts nicely with Ginsberg's clean, effects-laden backing vocals. This song would go on to be the lead single of the album and do moderately well with backing from the new Jackass movie's promotion. The song's original demo was featured in Bam Margera's CKY 2K and doesn't feature the Final Cut's iconic synth bridge. I think it's pretty damn interesting to see how close the song is to being fully written at this point and just how focused they were in gearing up for this album. The third track is Sink into the Underground. This song serves as a much-needed release from the extreme intensity displayed on the previous two tracks, and with that being said, the song isn't that much of a let-up. The main riff is without a doubt one of the tastiest riffs I've ever heard. And hey, I still vividly remember 2013 me hearing it for the first time ever, and feeling as if maybe I'd heard it before. In truth, I just think it felt familiar because that kind of riff just needed to exist. It's the kind of riff that you hear and you lambast yourself for not thinking of it sooner. The chorus of this song comes as a bit of a bizarre left turn, and one that definitely took me off guard on my first listen. Now, if you want to hear something really fucking cool, you should look around for the original demo that the hook riff appeared on. In 1996, Darren Miller and Jess Margera were pursuing a sci-fi death metal project entitled Foreign Objects. Now, if sci-fi death metal sounds weird to you, go listen to death metal in 1993. It got pretty fucking weird, man. In any case, Miller and Margera also did some one-off brutal death metal demo tapes, one of which featured an untitled track that has a more intense version of the riff that would come later on Sink into the Underground. The fourth track and second single from the album is Attached at the Hip, and while I find this one to be my least favorite on the album, that's not saying much. The song is still fantastic and it's up there in terms of catchiness, but the songwriting here doesn't seem as strong as the previous three tracks. Despite this, the hushed and brooding verses add some great diversity to an album that has already been so full force so far. Jess's drumming seems extremely simplistic on this track, and it seems that only he can pull this kind of thing off without seeming boring. His drumming perfectly suits the mood in a way that doesn't distract from the atmosphere, and the song's chorus is the closest to mainstream rock that CKY has ever gotten at this point, and it still feels entirely unique. Attached at the Hip did well on local Pennsylvania radio, but failed to make its mark on national radio. Obviously, Island could have stepped up with more cash, but I think the album's promotion could have benefited from a stronger follow-up single. But more on that later. The next track is Frenetic Amnesic. While opening up on a single guitar, it leaves the listener the chance to predict the coming madness to follow. When everything kicks in, the main riff is almost drowned out by a whining, but I guess still complimentary synth. And while I absolutely love this song and its eerie synth leads, I could certainly see how it could be a divisive track for some. This song features one of Jess's coolest drum performances, as his two-handed start-stop approach to 16th note patterns is something that I could only expect to hear in R&B and hip-hop drumming. Now that I mention it, I did have a year-long 90s gangster rap phase before I heard this album, and there's no doubt in my mind that this song, with its rap-like drumming composition and reliance on synth as a backbone, did well to, well, smooth out my musical transition. The bridge is certainly something to behold, as the synth feels right out of something you'd hear on an Ice Cube record in 1993. While not the best track on this record, the composition is short and sweet, and Darren's vocal performance really shines through. Track 6 is Shock and Terror, and while it feels more reminiscent of a sludgier heavy metal from its first moments, the verse riff is as intricate as it is compelling. Even Darren Miller has said in the past that the chorus riff was in large part inspired by Kiss's Detroit Rock City. Shock and Terror stands in my mind as one of the more underrated tracks, and one that I think could have done well if it were released as a third or fourth single. This track doesn't feature any sharp twists or turns, and is about as straightforward as it gets from such a dynamic group. The Moog synths are mostly buried in the background on this track, and it definitely seems like the kind of gateway song you could show to your older friends or relatives who are more accustomed to straightforward rock, a la, Guns N' Roses and the like. Plastic Plan is a welcome and unexpected surprise from such a hard-hitting album. From the onset, funky guitars and an overall 70s disco vibe permeate the sound. During the choruses, 3 separate drum tracks can be heard playing quarter, eighth, and 16th notes simultaneously, showing that producer Ginsberg's mind for sonic manipulation truly knows no bounds. Miller has been quoted as saying that the main riff of this song was written in 8th grade and originally featured on a yet unreleased demo tape by a joke glam band that he was in called Aches and Pains with longtime friend Dave Mosca. Plastic Plan in many ways was written as a pop song that satirizes pop songs. With lyrics like, "One day I'll try to give the world a view," it really sums up CKY's long-standing goal to wake up the youth to, I guess, a different musical sensibility. While being the simplest both in song structure and overall riff composition, the song manages to add another layer of diversity in an already impossible-to-label record. Is it rock? Is it metal? Is it fucking disco? I don't know, but it's fucking great. Inhuman Creation Station. I must have listened to this song for a week straight. Everything about this track is perfect to me. From the deeply layered melodies to the almost prog-like bridge riff to the prominent bass line featured in the chorus, this song does well to show off CKY in its truest form, thinking man's rock. Now, you couldn't really play this at a bar or at a party. It's the kind of shit you have to sit down and pay attention to. And if that sounds like the face went too intelligent, I don't even fucking care at this point. It's that good. Another really sick part of this song is the snare sound. Now again, if you aren't entirely convinced that the production of this album isn't Black Album levels of genius, give this one a listen. Chad Ginsberg utilizes a production technique on this track known as preverb. When the snare hits, it sounds as if it's playing backwards first and building to it. That's just layman's terms, but it's a fascinating technique, and I really implore you to do further research into the concept, as it can really add a layer of depth to a song, as it did here. Track 9, Sporadic Movement, is without a doubt the heaviest on the album. From the get-go, the instrumentation is unapologetically balls to the wall. Darren's vocals here are at their angriest and most intense. And the main riff is kind of reminiscent of Cult of Personality, but if that song was fucking good and actually worth listening to. This is one of the few tracks on the record in which the bass is very noticeable, and there's a strong sense of heaviness and distortion on the bass on this track in particular. I also think that the bass performance by Darren Miller is perfectly fitting for this song. Oh yeah, by the way, Darren Miller played the fucking bass on the first 3 albums as well. The song ends with a perfectly built crescendo point that comes back to the main riff with an accompanied layered scream by Darren. Now, if you listen closely, you can hear at least 3 different screams going on at the same time for nearly 25 seconds, with one of them being an all-out death metal scream. Now, whether or not this was a feat of clever audio engineering or Miller's god-tier lungs remains a mystery to me, but what remains important is how well it brings the album to its highest point of intensity. Close Yet Far is the final track on this album, and my god. It's gonna be hard to wrap this whole thing up on a song like this, but I'll do my best. Close Yet Far is one of my favorite songs of all time, period. What may initially sound to some as just another power ballad, I think Close Yet Far shines in its simple yet overproduced nature. When's the last time you've heard synthesizers in a ballad work so well with the music? Fucking never. Don't even fucking try me on this. Fuck you. The song is precise in expressing emotion without being too long-winded. Metallica. And melancholy and introspective without being too whiny or self-important. Every fucking 2000s rock band. I think the greatest achievement of this song is the ability to end an album chock full of chaotic, borderline proggy rock riffs with a moody, acoustic-driven ballad and not sound out of place on this album. You know, to follow a song like Sporadic Movement with a ballad is an extremely bold move, but I think it paid off. This, to me, should have been the album's second single. What a way to catch the average mainstream rock listener off guard and lure them into something so different. After hearing this, you really ought to check out the original demo of this track. It was featured on the very first pressing of CKY Volume 2, which is so rare that even I don't have it, but it's since leaked online. The song was originally recorded when Darren and Jess were in the band Oil, which was a failed experiment in trying to make more palatable music. And while they didn't really create more palatable music, they ended up creating the foundation of what would become CKY and wrote several songs that would be featured on Volume 1. The original demo of Close Yet Far, however, was titled It's Time, and it wasn't quite the polished gem it would become later on. It was featured in a promo video for Fairman Skate Shop on 411 magazine, issue number 19. On Volume 2, it was listed as Fairman's song, and it's probably a lot easier to find this demo under that title. As the story goes, CKY fans loved Fairman's song so much that they intensely demanded it be re-recorded. CKY was happy to oblige, and what would result is one of my favorite final tracks of all time. And with this as the closer, CKY solidified their album formula. Heaviest song is the penultimate, and the mellowest song is the closer. Think of all of the bands who just slapped their ballad in the middle of the album. After being left something to think about as the album closes, the track listing on an album was really something that finally revealed its importance to me. And ever since, I've paid much more attention to the track list and what they mean to the album as a whole. As if I couldn't stress enough CKY's musical diversity, the song wraps everything in a nice package that really left me wondering what the fuck genre I just listened to. Infiltrate, Destroy, Rebuild did reasonably well for a band that received such little label promotion, at approximately 300,000 units sold to this day. In fact, the album itself was completed in February 2002, but was delayed by Island Records until September 2002, at which point it had already been leaked for a few weeks. While it wasn't the massive sales success the band had hoped for, the band's dedicated fan base across the globe had helped the band spread the sweet sounds far and wide, and CKY would even open up for Guns N' Roses and Metallica. Their next album would be a step forward in songwriting maturity, but a step backward in the stifling nature of the creative process.
of something to believe. Though I never, 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 ever wanted this to be.
How many butts am I gonna have to cut before you people realize not to be dummies?
Like, you're a killer. You don't say dummy.